Hello, everyone. Good morning and good evening. Thank you so much for joining us. This is the international conference organized by the Consortium of Indo-Pacific researchers and titled Great Power Competition, a challenge to the rule-based order. And this is our third panel of this conference, the Horn of Africa, a big power games amid the regional crisis is very important to discuss here. And I would like to thank Mr. Ambassador Anil Trigunath, who accepted our invitation to chair this session. I would like to introduce Mr. Ambassador here, and then I will hand over it to you, Mr. Ambassador. Mr. Ambassador Trigunath is a member of the Indian Foreign Service. He has served in the Indian mission in Cote d'Ivoire, Bangladesh, Mongolia, United States, Russia, Sweden, Nigeria, Libya, and Jordan. He served as an ambassador of India to Jordan and Libya and as High Commissioner to Malta. He is the author of The Tricks on Track Diplomacy Unwound for the India Observer, USA. As a visiting fellow, he conducted research work on WTO and regional trading blocs at the Oxford University. He has recently edited a book titled Evolving Security Dynamics in West Asia and India's Challenges. He is a frequent writer and contributor on the issues of India's foreign policy, South Asia and West Asia. Thank you so much, Ambassador, for joining us here. And before handing over to you, let me announce that views expressed and presented here are personal, should not be construed to any organization and any institutions. Thanks so much. Mr. Ambassador, floor
Thank
over
you.
to you.
Thank you, Dr. Indu Saxena and Mr. Mangesh Sawant and all the other distinguished organizers of this very important conference by the CIPR. And basically a challenge to rule-based order is the great power competition that you are saying. Frankly, this is in the nature of the great powers or the power as it is, to indulge in competition, supremacy, hegemony. So there is nothing new about it. Unfortunately, today we are going through our transitional global order. And in my view, we are nearing, if the hot war is not happening, then we might be nearing a Cold War 2.0, which will be far worse and far more nuanced and insidious than the one that we had witnessed earlier in the 70s, 60s, 80s, after the Second World War. So we are in that sense, as we know that the pivot has frankly moved towards the Indo-Pacific. And in the Indo-Pacific, while the Sino-US rivalry is continuing to define the new contours of the global power dynamic, I believe that the Horn of Africa or the Red Sea or the Northern West Asian Indian Ocean region, all these are very important and strategic geographies, which will invite a great power competition. And so the Horn of Africa, as we say, might have locking of the horns among various powers. And that is something that is going to be extremely destabilizing, because if you come to think of it, both in West Asia and in Africa, we are seeing a lot of instability, a large number of hotspots, and these states which are strategically located in the Horn are as such becoming, in my view, if not the vassal state, at least the rentier states for the superpowers and in their games. Now, while the major superpowers like USA, China, and Russia are a given, and one understands that they will continue to have their bases, they'll continue to dictate policies wherever they can and have the regimes that they want and remove the regimes that they don't want. That is something that is understandable. But China has obviously gone in a very big way into Africa, as we know. And the USA is seen somewhat from the West Asian countries to be moving away or being at least a bit nonchalant to their security concerns. And this is why we are seeing that all the countries in the region are moving or developing, especially the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, including Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, Oman, and Kuwait, who are Bahrain, which are looking towards Act East policy. We have also seen the growth of Abraham Accords across the continent, and that is something that might give rise to an alternate global or a regional kind of a grouping, in my view, if the Cold War 2.0 actually happens. And I call it as CRIPTAC. CRIPTAC means, in my view, China, Russia, Iran, Pakistan, Turkey, Afghanistan, and Qatar. Qatar might be an outlier because it is equally close to the Americans as it is close to the Chinese. Or now Saudi Arabia's and UAE's, the resultant engagement with China has been very, very close. Most of the countries in Africa and in the Middle East are part of the China's BRI project. We see that from Iran to Israel, China is present everywhere. And as the American defense strategy and others indicate clearly that China, after Xi Jinping's third avatar, we would see will go all out now to secure its interest, as has been seen in their statements also. Now, as far as the Red Sea or the Horn of Africa is concerned, we know that this is a geography whose geopolitical importance cannot be underestimated because it's a major axis essentially for movement of connectivity and trade, about 10% between three continents of Asia, Africa, and Europe. And over 30,000 merchant ships pass through it, including the oil tankers. And there are umpteen number of statistics available to justify that. We have the Bab el-Mandab Straits, which is a choke point, and then which is southern entrance of the Red Sea, essentially, and a very important strategic junction. And that connects to the Suez Canal. And we know that the Suez Canal, how important it is. When we saw this Panamanian ship in March 2021, which was actually being navigated or piloted by an Indian crew. The whole trade got so much of, got disruption. Now, one of another aspect of this region, in my view, is that Red Sea Basin is also trying to, is said to have about 5 billion barrels of undiscovered oil and about over 110 billion cubic feet of recoverable gas. Now, that is obviously understood that in that situation, it will become an economic or geoeconomic contestation point or an area. This has also been said that the Bab el-Mandab, as it is called, is the center of the world. They call it like that. Another thing in the pandemic times, we have seen that the food and maritime security have also become significantly important. And as we at one time used to say that the future wars will be for the water, I think now we are looking at a greater contestation for food and maritime security as the situation, or the weaponization, frankly, of various instruments, be it the financial instruments by the West or the energy and food or fertilizers by the Russians takes place. So there are several major powers now, as we see, which are working. I mean, it is not only the superpowers as it is, but the regional powers are also trying to position themselves. And among them, of course, Turkey is very important. Saudi Arabia is another one. And so is Egypt is the resident power. And we have UAE, which has great ambitions to move forward. Qatar itself. So even though they are having their internal contestations there that are being displayed, be it in Somalia, Somaliland, or in Djibouti. Now, Djibouti is frankly a country which is, I would say, you can look at it in whichever way, but this is also some kind of a rentier state in that sense, because there are nearly every major power is present because of its strategic location, by way of their bases. There is China, there is France, there is UK, and all the others. I mean, the large number of them which are present there, And that causes a bit of a concern for everyone. India is also trying to do something with Japan and France and some other countries to have some kind of this. The piracy has been a major problem. Fortunately, it has been reduced, but the pirates have converted into terrorist groups now. We already know about Al-Shabaab, which doesn't have the piracy in that sense, but they are being combined and they are becoming increasingly more powerful in the region. So I think that Somalia, we have seen what has happened to in the country, or the Al-Shabaab, or for example, even in Nigeria, which is not directly relevant in this, but it does have its own Boko Haram. So all these, then we are having the internal problems like between Ethiopia and Egypt over the dam, or the Tigray conflict, or some others. They are also, Ethiopia, Eritrea, and all these countries are having their own major problems. The Yemen war, Houthis' role that they are playing in this whole thing, they are becoming increasingly a threat to the maritime traffic, and they have been using their drones and others, against the Saudis and the UAE. We have seen that. So and then the migration is taking place from the Horn of Africa towards the Gulf countries. So all these factors really have brought about or converted it into a major theater of rivalries. So I think that this is something that we are going to discuss today from the real experts who have been part of the region and have greatly done their research work and have very authentic say about the trends that are happening in the region and how they are going to play out amidst these superpower rivalries, as well as the major countries in the region, how they're doing. So I'm very privileged to be moderating this session with such distinguished participants and panelists. And I would like to first invite Dr. Scott Edmondson, who is the Associate Professor at the Air University, USA, and of Regional and Cultural Studies in Africa at the Air Force Culture and Language Center, Alabama. He holds a PhD in Culture and Performance from the University of California, Los Angeles, a former Peace Corps volunteer in Cote d'Ivoire, which was my first posting, incidentally, in Africa, and he is a Fulbright Hays Fellow in Ghana. He has conducted ethnographic field research in West Africa on popular media production and religious movements, and has worked as a socio-cultural intelligence analyst for the 4MISG US Army Special Operations and the US AFRICOM. Dr. Edmondson, the floor is yours for about 10 to 12 minutes. Kindly give your initial thoughts, then we'll have some questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. The honor is all mine. And I do have a few slides. If I can share the screen here, let me try. Okay. Everyone see that all right? I don't know what's showing.
Yep.
Voila. Samash, I hope that was a very excellent rundown, and I'll try not to duplicate too much of that. I think what I wanted to do today was just kind of do a little bit of a scene setter with regards to the Horn, and then talk about the way in which the U.S. strategic vision towards Africa and perhaps the Horn in particular has shifted over the past few administrations. I think part of the framing of this panel is that when you do have a number of these great powers playing their games and engaging in that sort of competition, it doesn't necessarily bode well for regional stability and security and stability for the Africans themselves. I would agree to some extent that that kind of great power competition frame demonstrates a sort of a more imperialist imagination that persists in terms of seeing Africa, seeing the continent still as a place to carve up and as a proxy for other sorts of contestations that don't necessarily lead to again, security and stability in the region. But there could be a way in which I think to think beyond that, there may be a way to get that sort of interest in Africa and the continent to help to develop other kinds of visions that are maybe more multilateral and cooperative versus only competitive. As the ambassador said, we are dealing with a region that even internally, and I don't know that you can ever try to analyze what goes on internally into the region as if it existed in a vacuum from external actors. But even amongst the countries themselves, those histories have always been kind of entangled, internally competitive amongst the various countries there, rivalries, even interstate wars at times. And so that's been incredibly complicated itself, to say nothing of the fact when you have not only great powers, but other powers, regional powers involved in a region that has been given, I think, to varying degrees, depending upon the states, to significant levels of what some would call extroversion. In other words, politics that are more beholden to these outside actors and donors than the citizenry in the country itself. You could look to, I think Somalia is probably one of the more prime examples of that. But as the ambassador said, Djibouti as a kind of a landlord for the world in that key piece of geography. All different sorts of conflicts and violence that exist in the region, obviously most notably groups like Al-Shabaab that have persisted for now over 15 or more years in a state that has yet to cohere after some decades. We recently had, in the last couple of days, at least a ceasefire declaration in the Ethiopian conflict in Tigray, but which some have called, some analysts have referred to as genocide. At least there have been documented cases of severe crimes against humanity, rape as a weapon, etc. Some of the worst stuff that we can do to one another. And to say nothing about kind of the contestations and the violence in South Sudan, and in the kind of the battle between more democratic movements and Khartoum versus military rule, and also some of the competition that takes place there with the key port, not only with Turkey as shown on the map here, but in terms of military rulers, various associations with Russia, China, or even the United States. There's been some fairly significant U.S. Okay, sorry. I think my Wi-Fi is acting up on me. I'm not sure if folks can still see or hear me. Nevertheless, I will attempt to drive on here. So again, and to say nothing about the water potential for conflict over Egyptian threats to bomb the dam in Ethiopia, etc. To say the least, these are fraught strategic geographies globally. In terms of the U.S. Frame for the continent and for this region, which has been persistent for the last decade or so, has been coming out of a kind of a focus on the war on terror, and Africa as oftentimes framed as the next front on that war, and the numbers do bear out that a lot of the preponderance of violence and deaths, according at the hands of violent extremists, some of that center of gravity can be argued to have shifted to the continent, but that has strategically kind of been an American preoccupation for quite some time, and I think there's been a sense that while we were focused on that, China through BRI and other initiatives, other kinds of relationships with African elites, has made significant inroads on the continent. While we weren't, there's sort of a sense that while we were focused on prosecuting the global war on terror, that they have moved in other sectors, economic primarily, and in terms of investment and infrastructure development and that sort of thing, telecommunications, media, you name it. There was back in the Obama administration a pivot to Asia, that culminated during the Trump administration when we started to use the term great power competition in our key strategic documents. It was kind of hard to tell what the Africa policy was in the last administration. The highest level delegation that we sent at the time was Secretary of State Tillerson. He was sort of fired over Twitter while he was in Kenya, which didn't demonstrate a whole lot of prioritization towards the continent. Later, a speech that John Bolton made was criticized for being less of an Africa policy and more of a China and Africa policy. Again, seeing the continent as sort of a backdrop for these larger, these greater games, these larger strategic interests. I think the AFRICOM commander tried to soften that a little bit. He started to discuss it as global power competition, and that everything we did there was that didn't mean that we were not going to be a preferred partner in terms of security cooperation and trying to counter violent extremism and professionalization of military, et cetera. And that leads to the more recently released strategy, which I think it is at least new and different in terms of its tone, and in terms of its emphasis on recognizing African agency, that we're going to take Africa seriously in its own terms and the aspirations of its growing populations, et cetera. And it's kind of, leading out of, hopefully, as the ambassador said, trying to perhaps avoid a Cold War 2.0, a kind of a de-emphasis on, we're not here to say, China is bad. We're here to try to offer what we can in terms of these four main bullet points. I do think that Africa can be a key part of the current administration's attempt to frame the coming competition as one between authoritarianism and democracy, and we can talk about that in a discussion whether or not that's going to be potentially productive and conducive to the support of more democratic movements on the continent, or whether that's just more of the same sort of us versus them. I'll stop there. I think I've gone my time, but looking forward to the discussion to see what are the possibilities for or alternatives, I would say, to these more kind of imperialist imaginations and great power plays, to more multilateral cooperation, trade, investment, exchange, etc. This is the image on the lower right there on a particular sort of dream city for trade in Djibouti. Could it be a hub for that sort of thing? And I'll stop there and turn it over to my colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Edmondson, for that very detailed and incisive analysis and the situation, how it is prevailing and what is the US approach. That's absolutely correct, that now we have to recognize that Africa is for Africans. Unless we have that approach and give up the sort of gold rush kind of a thing, I think that it'll be very, very difficult to even help them if the countries really wish to do that. And another thing you might mention about China, of course, we'll have some questions on that also. But most of the countries, their policy towards Africa has actually been driven by China's rise in Africa or acceptance in Africa. Especially at the leadership level, we have seen that whenever there is a criticism on its debt trap or debt diplomacy, the biggest defense in China come the leadership of those countries. And they say that we have had these colonial masters who tried to do that. And as you know, if you have followed the France-Africa summit, at that time, the South African the president, Ramaphosa, said that just desist from the vaccine apartheid. Now, you see, so that kind of narrative still prevails in Africa. But thank you so much. And we'll then come back to some of the questions from you. I would now like to invite Dr. Christopher Jasparo, Associate Professor at the U.S. Naval War College. Dr. Jasparo is an Associate Professor in the National Security Affairs Department and Director, Africa Regional Studies Group. He also most recently worked for the U.S. Marine Corps and Command and Staff College and Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies, as well as taught for several civilian universities. He has extensive experience as a field archaeologist with additional experience in cartography and geographic analysis for economic, town, and transportation planning. He holds a doctorate in geography from the University of Kentucky, a master's in geography from the University of North Carolina, and a bachelor's in anthropology and geography from the University of Vermont. Dr. Christopher, may I invite you to give your thoughts?
Great, thank you, Ambassador. Good morning, everyone, or afternoon, depending where you are. I was a late addition, so I don't have any formal graphics prepared, but I think my remarks will largely echo that of the Ambassador and Scott's, but maybe from a slightly different angle. So I have four main points I'd like to make. And as I was looking at the region, trying to figure out where I could maybe add a unique perspective, I tried to look at it as a geographer. And I think the first point I'd like to make, which also echoes some of the detailed comments the Ambassador gave, is the centrality of the region can't be underestimated. It's a convergence point and connecting point for almost all the major regions of the world, with the exception of North and South America. Everybody abuts it. And I think sometimes that's underappreciated in the United States, with the exception of, maybe traffic going through the straits. The second point I'd like to make is the security dynamics cross scale from global to regional to local, and they all intersect. So it's a very dynamic and complex environment where you have interactions across geographic scales, whether we're talking global powers, regional powers, local conflicts, and how they wrap together. And you also see this convergence with security threats. So if we look at almost every security threat type in the world, it's happening simultaneously in this region. We have great power competition, we have civil wars, we have transnational terrorism, maritime crime, transnational crime, population movements, disease, environmental and climate impacts. So if we think of the suite of security problems in the world and problems that are likely coming, they're already all acting simultaneously in this region. But that's also to some extent balanced off, as Scott was saying, against opportunities. There is trade and investment opportunities. There's resource potential. Depending on how you define the Horn of Africa, it's a region of 280 million or so people, which is going to grow. Some of the more dynamic and diversified economies in Africa are on the East African coast. So there's also a tremendous amount of opportunity, and there's also cooperation. I mean, we have UN operations, African Union operations, all sorts of IGOs, NGOs, states cooperating. So it's not all competition. So this brings up to my third point, which I like Scott's term, Horn of Dilemma, is that we have some tension. So as a political geographer, you could look at the region, and some people would call it a gateway region, because the Horn is sort of the gateway to the Gulf, Mediterranean, East Africa, Eastern Sahel, Central Africa. On the other hand, it functions as a shatter belt where you have local conflicts and tensions converging with those of bigger regional and global powers. And these are operating in tension and simultaneous with each other. Again, at this point, both threats and opportunities also exist in parallel, as well as cooperation and conflict. So looking ahead, framing, for example, from a policy angle, framing the region, I think along the lines Scott said, is very important. Because in some cases, how you approach a problem defines how the problem plays out. So if we look at it exclusively from a conflict threat angle, I don't think things bode well. That doesn't mean looking at the opportunities negates the perils in the region. But there has to be a multifaceted view if anything positive is going to happen in the long run. And I also think there's a lesson more broadly for the rest of the world. So I think the dynamics we're seeing in this region are sort of a more pronounced version of what we're seeing develop geopolitically and geoeconomically globally. And so I think in some ways, the Horn of Africa is the maybe canary in the coal mine. And how the different actors in that region either deal with the problems or make them worse, I think, may signal how greater geopolitical trends are going to play out worldwide. So another reason I think to focus on this region beyond its centrality is that in a way it's the leading edge of emerging security environment. And what happens in the Horn of Africa may be a harbinger of what happens everywhere else. So it bears a lot of both analytical and policy attention. And on the American side in particular, I think much more than we've been giving it. And so I'll close my remarks there.
Thank you, Dr. Jasparo. You very rightly mentioned that, of course, the centrality of the region has to be kept in mind, or sub-region, if we are going to look at it only at the Horn's perspective. And this reflects the larger malaise, whatever conflicts and competition that we see in the geoeconomic or geostrategic contestation. And of course, you rightly mentioned that one has to look at it in a more comprehensive manner, not in a unifocal or partisan manner as far as the problems, threats, opportunities are concerned. So the SWOT analysis needs to be really very objective, so to say, if we wish to help them or help ourselves. That's the thing. So thank you so much for those brilliantly put comments. Now I would like to invite Dr. Michael Kontek to share his thoughts. Mr. Michael is PhD scholar at the Rutgers University. He has several years of academic research and consulting experience in Southern and Western Africa, Europe, and the United States. Michael possesses expertise in the areas of gender and development, human security, ethics, and global governance, as well as criminal justice. The floor is yours, Mr. Kontek.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And I want to thank the panelists that have gone before me. Firstly, let me thank the organizers for this very important consortium, because it's very important to discuss this very, very important. I couldn't agree more with Dr. Jasparo in terms of what he was saying about the centrality of the region and the gateway. But having said that, I am yet to defend my thesis, my dissertation. So I am a future doctor. Now, I want to just, set the record straight there before I go. So okay. It's very important. I pretty much like what those who have come before me have done. Dr. Edmondson laid the ground very much, even yourself, Ambassador, giving an overview of things. But I want to focus my attention as well to what is really happening in the Horn of Africa. Of course, you talked about Djibouti being the landlord of the world with so many great powers there. And obviously, when we look at the rule-based order, we begin to understand those pattern of structure of relations that really play out in this part of the Horn of Africa, and how important it is, and indeed can be the abigail of what happens anywhere else. I would like to focus on what's going on in Ethiopia, because there are all kinds of security threats, and I want to look in terms of the human security threats and what has been done to ameliorate that situation by South Africa actually playing a leading role of inviting the Ethiopians and the Tigrayan forces to a peace talk, which now we heard since yesterday, both the government and those forces have agreed to a permanent cessation of hostility. And of course, we know the African Union, led by former President Olusegun Obasanjo, is playing a leading role in those peace talks. But what I would like to focus on really is to understand that in as much as we know that great power competition is natural, and obviously the strong will do as they please, and the weak will suffer as they must. This is, it's a zero-sum game. There are always losers and winners. But I am looking at the Horn of Africa and look at the ways that the whole issue around the coloniality, you know, looking at it, that this is really born out of a realization that the modern world is an asymmetrical world order. And this world order, it's sustained not only by the colonial metrics of power, but also it's one that's by the pedagogies that are out there, and also the epistemologies of the equilibrium that really continue to produce alienated Africans, which is also fueling those conflicts. What I'm trying to say is that these alienated Africans that's been produced, that we are socialized into 8 in Africa, and that produce them and us to like Europe and America, and as such, the schools, the colleges, the churches, the universities. So the entire social structure creates those are the sites of the reproduction of those coloniality. And hence, these kinds of conflicts, internal conflicts that we see becomes all too familiar. So far we don't have the real understanding of trying to generate research to understand from the African perspective what is fueling these kinds of crises. At what point in time, at what point in we know of the geopolitical, we know that the US encouraged the statements from Washington, encouraged the peace talks in South Africa, and are surprised by all the bombing and the indiscriminate killing. But what I would say is this, that in this decoloniality, the research methods and the research methodologies are never accepted as neutral, but you see they are unmasked as technologies of subjugation, if not surveillance tools that actually prevent the emergence of another kind of thinking, because that is questioned, and that kind of knowledge which does not align to the narratives that these great powers would want to purport and give such resonance would not be taken into the mainstream thinking. So that prevents the emergence of another thinking, another logic, and another worldview. And so in this kind of thinking, in trying to understand this conflict, and in terms of understanding the way the great powers and the great competition, whether it's China, whether it's, because we do not have just a unipolar, or we have multiple global players now as well. And so the research methodology tools in terms of understanding this conflict are actually, in my view, have become gatekeeping tools as well. But as I said, in terms of the human security, while we are focusing on the great power and what it means for them, we need to also look at the untold human suffering, this conflict, and the policies and the power play of this great power that brings to the region in terms of inaccessibility of food and poor access of water, in terms of even the climate change issues of drought. And so, and this is causing the rise not only in malnutrition among children, but also across entire communities. You look at their livelihood of cattle and livestock. These have already suffered tremendously. But in all, we know that while the security threats also exist, there is also the need to understand that there are opportunities, and we need to begin to look at how do we, in a way, understand using, because context matters in this, using African methodologies in understanding African problems. And of course, like we said, the Horn of Africa, it is really the gateway region, and whatever happens there, because of its centrality, I think Dr. Jaspero said it's really good. Being the geographer, he understands, you know, the positionality of that region within the whole global order. So I think those will be my thoughts for now. And thank you once more for having me participate in this important conversation.
Thank you, Mr. Conte. That was, I would say, the first-hand perspective of the thing. And you very clearly mentioned that some of the things that I really had not heard and liked it now is the alienated Africans, coloniality dimension of it, the technology of subjugation, which is something that one has to keep in mind, because the world is post-pandemic, and especially Africa and other countries are suffering, in my view, with 4H that are going to be the immense priority. And one of them is hunger, the habitat, health, and the technology, high tech or otherwise. So these are going to be important. And you also mentioned that research methodologies need to be Africanized, or African methodologies, to understand Africa, because the context matters. So thank you very much for putting into context this thing. And that's when we say Africa for Africans, means we must take that view, and it should not be merely a talking point. It should mean business and must be understood and applied in our discourse. Thank you so much once again for bringing that perspective. Now I'd like to request Mr. Omar Mahmood to give us his dimension, because he's a senior analyst and researcher and has been working in the region. So Mr. Omar, the floor is yours, and we look forward to hear your considered views in the matter.
Thank you, Ambassador, and appreciate the chance to participate in this panel today. I think I'll structure, my remarks basically, kind of the way I look at the Horn and the way I approach it is a bit from a layered perspective that I think we heard from the second speaker already. I mean, I think to understand what's happening at the great power level, you have to understand what's happening in the Horn. You have to understand what's happening at the middle power level. And there's been significant changes on all three of those levels within the Horn in the recent years. And it's that interaction between these levels, which I think is spurring a high degree of instability. It doesn't have to, and that's something we can talk about, how to channel that elsewhere. But I do think we've seen that go in that direction. So, at that first layer, what we have happening in the Horn over the past couple of years is, I don't think it's dramatic to say, but really a once in a generation sort of transition period. You've had a series of protests in Ethiopia that led to a change of leadership. A couple of years ago, you had a similar dynamic play out in Sudan. These were really very significant popular resistance that actually essentially toppled dictatorships or systems that had been in place for quite some time. And I think the Horn is still working through the ramifications of that. These transitions are never that easy. You can argue, especially in the case of Ethiopia and Sudan, really, that they've kind of gone off the rails quite a bit. But I think the starting point is to understand, the last time the Horn went through such significant transformation was really the early 90s, which was the end of the Cold War, which is kind of interesting for our discussion as well. And I think there's probably, two ramifications of that, or implications that I think we see. The first is it's kind of redrawn the internal alliance structure within the Horn. So the new leaders have made new alliances, and they've rendered kind of what we knew about the Horn and the set of bilateral relations we knew about the Horn previously almost irrelevant. So for example, Ethiopia and Eritrea now have a very significant relationship. At one point, Somalia was part of that as well. The main operating sort of fault line within the Horn for the 2 decades before 2018 was actually that Ethiopia and Eritrea were key adversaries. And so you've seen kind of a change in alliances, and that's really shaken things up. I think the other implication we've seen as a result of these transitions is that, previously we had a set of security relationships in the Horn that was based on Ethiopia being the hegemon. And as the transition in Ethiopia has gone down, a different sort of path, I think you've had Ethiopia become more distracted, more internally focused, more weakened, that it's not projecting itself within the Horn in the same sort of way. And of course, that opens up opportunities, but again, it's a transition period when you go from a very set sort of security structure, security umbrella based on the power of a hegemon to all of a sudden something a bit more diverse and different. And I think one clear manifestation of that is we're actually seeing Kenya kind of step up its foreign policy a little bit in that role, and the fact that Uhuru Kenyatta, the previous president of Kenya, was part of the Tigray peace negotiations with the Ethiopian government, I think is a very significant manifestation of that. And so that's what's happening kind of in the Horn. I think if you zoom out to the region and what we often call these middle powers, I would highlight Turkey, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Qatar in particular with their relevance to the Horn. I think you had some significant changes there. And that's probably been one of the big changes here in the Horn over the past decade, that these are now players in the Horn. They're very active. You could argue that historically they had these relationships and maybe they were on pause for a while, but regardless, they are very much active and players in the Horn once again. And they all operate a little bit differently. They have some different interests, some different procedures that they go through, different things they're trying to achieve. But the simple fact is that they are active in the Horn. And I think, when this first kicked off, there was a question about, well, is this a temporary sort of involvement? Are these countries really here to stay long-term in the Horn? And then I think the answer that we've gotten over time is yes, they are. Yes, it may ebb and flow, particularly when, budgets are tighter within those countries, because of COVID, for example, or right now Turkey's going through an economic crisis. So yes, they can't project as much as they can at other times. And yes, the Horn is important, but it might not always be the number one foreign policy priority of these countries. I think they'll still look elsewhere. But the fact is they do see the Horn as very relevant, whether that's as a marketplace for their goods, a source of investment. Some countries like Saudi Arabia, for example, see Sudan as very useful for its food security, Ethiopia as well. So you've seen these linkages back and forth, whether it's on the security front, the war in Yemen, and when Saudi Arabia and the UAE ramped up their involvement in that really actually brought the Horn into the picture a little bit, because it was useful to have military options based off of the Horn to get into Yemen. I think the Red Sea security dynamic is also bringing these parties together and is part of the long-term dynamic of this relationship. Red Sea security is very crucial, especially for countries, all of these countries really. And so that brings them to look at the other side quite strongly as well. And so I do think you have this lasting factor. It will ebb and flow, but the reality is these middle powers are active, and they are active in the internal politics of the Horn as well. And this is a development that really wasn't there in this way about a decade ago. And then kind of zooming out to the top level, sort of the global level, what I think the conference is kind of getting at. I do think we're starting to see maybe the beginnings of, I don't want to say a new Cold War, but dynamics that are very similar to that. And we should remember, the Horn was one of the regions that was one of the most affected, I would argue, by the Cold War during that period. You had a devastating conflict between Ethiopia and Somalia. You had the US and the USSR at the time playing into that and on different sides of that. And so we saw very strong ramifications of the Cold War within the Horn. And I don't think it's a surprise that we saw that last generational transition in the Horn right as the time that sort of the Cold War period ended and things were changing around the world. So I think we have to understand that history and that interaction. But we're starting to see maybe this pick up in the Horn once again. The US has been there for a while, very strong counterterrorism focus. They partnered with Ethiopia as the regional hegemon on that. They established their military presence in Djibouti. They've been very active in the fight against Al-Shabaab in Somalia. So you see that very strong counterterrorism focus. But of course, with the US shift more towards the pivot to Asia, the focus on great power competition on China, and now because of the Ukraine war to a degree Russia, I think you start to see a shift in how they're operating within the Horn as well. And you start to see that focus on, what is China doing? What is Russia doing in this area? And so, I think that's to say that the US has been there, but their methods and how they look at it is probably shifting a bit. China is very active in parts of the Horn, I should say, the more secure parts, honestly, in Somalia, we don't see as much Chinese investment, for example, but in Ethiopia, we see a significant amount. Djibouti as well. I think these are parts of their Belt and Road Initiative, key aspects of that. But of course, there's a security component too, with China having a military base in Djibouti. And I think that shows how important this the Horn and the Red Sea, the Gulf of Aden as a maritime passageway is for everybody, at every level within this story, for actors within the Horn, for the middle powers, and also for the global powers as well. But we've seen China become increasingly, they've invested quite a bit in the Horn, but also start to come involved maybe in a different way as well, maybe starting to think about the stability of the Horn in order to back up those investments. So for example, China recently appointed a special envoy for the Horn, which follows on US efforts as well. And so that's a very interesting step in that regard. And they've been having consultations around how they see stability in the Horn. The third actor on the global stage is, of course, Russia. Russia is not as active in the Horn as these other two, but I do think we see them opportunistically trying to find some entry points here and there. For example, the Tigray War was one of those, because the government in Addis Ababa was coming under a significant threat of sanction, and even sanction from the US government. We saw the Russian foreign minister visiting Addis around the same time, and a little bit of a cozying up there. Though Russia has a bit of a hard sell within this region, because within this era of globalization, it has really been affected by the Ukraine crisis as well. Food prices have rocketed at a time when the region's going through a devastating humanitarian crisis. Grain and fertilizer imports have also slowed. So I think you do see Russia as more of a minor player in this, opportunistically trying to get involved. There's always these rumors of Russian interest also in some sort of Red Sea naval facility, but they haven't really been able to put that into practice. And so I think you see, that's kind of what's happening at each layer. And I think the involvement in what's happening is getting more intense and more complex at all of those layers for kind of the reasons mentioned. And that interaction is producing some very interesting implications. The first one I think I'd say is that, unfortunately, we do see the Horn at times becoming a proxy ground again for external rivalries. And that's layered onto internal sort of domestic fault lines within the Horn and aggravates them to a wider dispute. I think we've seen this happen a couple times. External actors tend to come with their baggage to the Horn and tend to ask or demand Horn countries kind of follow their own leads, basically. And the unfortunate reality is the countries of the Horn, anytime they're dealing with external actors, whether it's at the middle level or the higher level, there's a power imbalance there. And so for some countries, especially some of the smaller ones, it's difficult sometimes to manage that. So, we've seen this, a couple examples when the Gulf Cooperation Crisis Council dispute erupted a few years ago from the Gulf side. That was very much imported to the Horn. A country like Somalia, you had different actors basically siding with different, external actors on the Gulf side. Had nothing to do with what was going on in Somalia, but it widened a rift between domestic actors in Somalia because they had different external supporters and allies around that. I think, we're seeing this flare up a little bit now in very unexpected ways. One example I'll just highlight here is in the case of Somaliland, which of course is an unrecognized entity. It's broken from Somalia, but of course runs its own affairs and has its own administration there. Well, recently Somaliland's engaged Taiwan and developed a relationship there, which has actually led them to getting some support from conservative circles, mainly in the US and the UK, basically presenting itself as the anti-China bulwark, a pro-democracy element. And so you're starting to see that that's kind of had China react a little bit, both in Somaliland trying to woo it, but then also to up its support in Mogadishu, not at dramatic levels, but at something worth noting. And so you see even a very local dynamic, the dispute between Somalia and Somaliland is grafted now onto this global dynamic of competition between the US and China. And so we see that interaction, and it kind of tends to exacerbate, I think, gaps and really furthers divides rather than kind of pushing them together. So some very interesting cases happening in areas you wouldn't expect around that. So, that's one side. The other implication, though, and I think this has been mentioned, is this is an opportunity, or should be an opportunity, for actors in the Horn. They should have more options and be able to manage those options. And we see that a little bit. Again, I mentioned the case of Ethiopia cozying up to Russia, when it was coming under threat from the US because of the Tigray War, even though the US and Ethiopia have many more significant interests, whether that's trade relations or security relations, than Ethiopia has with Russia. But it sends a signal to other countries that, the Horn does have agency in this, that they can interact. But part of the problem is also this power imbalance. And I think when the Horn is not acting coherently itself, then it's also easier for outside actors to sort of pick it apart. And unfortunately, with some of the transitions and some of the changes we've had in the Horn, the multilateral institutions, whether that's IGAD or even the African Union, have been weakened within that. And so the Horn is also increasingly not responding as one, but much more divided themselves as well. So I think I'll leave it there. Maybe the last point I would make is just also not to see an ideological tie sometimes between the Horn's engagements with actors outside of it. I think it's very much interest driven. I think we saw that in the Cold War, regardless of what ideology different governments professed, and I think that continues here today. So I'll leave it there for my remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Umar. It was you covered nearly the whole gamut and brought about exactly how the Horn is being used as a proxy, frankly, for their own power politics, and there is a power imbalance. And the fact that Horn is not acting coherently is obviously a fertile ground for the kind of power politics. This is essentially interest driven, especially that's what the smaller powers try to do to exploit the situation to the best of their ability at a given time. And I think that we cannot fault them for this. But this is how if you see from the realist perspective, that's how the diplomacy or the international discourse is conducted in the current transitional world order. I would now have certain questions, so I thought I'll start with you first because you were the last to speak. Now, the two questions that you may perhaps like to take. One is that is Saudi Arabia applying the equivalent of Monroe doctrine in the Horn of Africa? And the second question is, do you see a role for the EU in terms of cooperation and conflict prevention?
Sure, thank you, Ambassador. Some interesting questions. I mean, on Saudi Arabia, I think it is, I think when we look at Saudi Arabia and how it's operating in the Horn compared to some of the other, Gulf actors, it is a little different because it's not getting involved in the internal politics so much, but rather it is more on the foreign policy side. And Saudi Arabia has come to the Horn multiple times and basically asked countries or incentivize them to align their foreign policy with Saudi interest. And so that's been to counter, Iranian influence. During the GCC crisis, it was to counter Qatari, presence, and also, of course, around Red Sea security. Saudi Arabia is trying to set up this Red Sea Security Council that's very embryonic. But basically, trying to create some sort of new forum, but a forum, obviously, of which they dominate as well. So I do think Saudi Arabia has kind of seen the Horn as its backyard and does see that these countries should be following its lead. They've had varying successes with that. I think they had more success on the anti-Iranian front than it did, when the GCC crisis broke down. It was difficult for them to get the Somali federal government on board, for example. And so, every time Saudi Arabia, I think, comes calling, maybe they're asking for a little bit more and a little bit more, and maybe it gets to be a bit too much. But I do think they see the Horn as an area where they can extend their own sort of foreign policy and also security interests around the Red Sea. On the EU, in terms of conflict prevention, I do think the EU has a role here. The EU has been quite active. In the past, a lot of that was channeled through IGAD, the regional mechanism, for a number of reasons. IGAD is basically a shell of its former self and isn't too active, partly being it's a collection of member states. If the member states aren't on the same page, if the member states don't give it authority to kind of act, there's very little IGAD can do. And so a divided Horn means, the lack of that multilateral response as well. But the EU has been, quite active in terms of on the Tigray war, for example. They were active in Somalia when there was an election dispute last year as well. And we've seen them play a mediating role in some certain areas in Somaliland a couple of years ago in a similar situation. So I do think they have an important role to play because they come at this from a multilateral standpoint as well. And so it's getting beyond some of the bilateral dynamics. Of course, they're also limited by that themselves because the EU is often divided member states wise in terms of their policy to certain countries or certain areas of the Horn. So I do think that's kind of their strength and weakness, but definitely a clear role for them to play.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That's absolutely perfect explanation. Now I'd like to ask Mr. Conte, the region has the poorest countries in the world. Will the Great Game lead to intensification of bilateral and multilateral conflicts, leading to more poverty?
Thank you very much, Ambassador. That's a great question. You're saying leading to more the last part of the question. Leading to
more poverty.
More poverty, yes. You see, what we see in terms of, and I would like to rotate back to the point of what Dr. Mahmoud was saying around where you find a semblance of the Cold War atmosphere coming, and also most of this Horn of Africa is also becoming the proxy ground for rivalry. I really think, given the way the world is going and the great power game is, I sincerely believe that it will intensify the power competition, and in a way, again, I would reiterate that the strong will do as they please, and the weak will suffer as they must. And I think until that the continent of itself and the developing countries also find ways of making sure that their voices are heard and where policy decisions are being made. And here I'm looking at the role of the United Nations. Of course, that might be a very difficult one given its structure in itself, but what kind of international organization, which is the only one that we have right now that seems to be able to bring all the world leaders and the powers that be together despite the balance of power. So there needs to be a way where that needs to be addressed, because as it now stands, the other issues which we're not paying attention to, which are the ones that are really generating much more poverty, be it drought, accessibility of water, food, and all those things. It doesn't affect the great powers so much as it affects the others. So those are not so many issues. I'm thinking of we just a typical example of those kind of manifestation. I mean, the internal conflict with the Tigrayan conflict in Ethiopia, the internal one, it's a bloody one. And while that was going on, it doesn't have so much resonance as opposed to Ukraine. Granted, Ukraine is, it's for all what it's worth, it's dangerous. That can also trigger so many other things, but it shows how the power game is playing and the significance and the value that is given to those that can make things happen in the world as opposed to the. So if there is not a way to deal with that, obviously poverty, much more suffering, much more human security threat will happen in not only in the Horn of Africa, but for the vast majority of the developing countries.
Thank you, Dr. Conte. That's unfortunate reality. That we are seeing that during this war and the pandemic, the SDGs have really gone for a toss, and no one cares about it anymore. Though there are a lot of statements coming from here and there, but let's see. Now I have a question which I would like to put to Dr. Jaspero. What should the US do to contain China's expansion in Africa?
Oh, that's a good question. First, once again, to reiterate Indu's point, I'm speaking just for myself, not my institution or the US government. First of all, and I'll draw on with this some of what Michael and Mamu just said, is I'm not sure the US should try to contain China. There are places where our interests diverge, but there are also areas where they either don't conflict or they do converge. So I think the United States has to look at the region. If it looks at the region just from kind of a macro scale, realist, great power dynamic, you may get into this thing of containing China, which is going to alienate a lot of actors in the region, and it's also going to be counterproductive. So if you look at what my predecessors were speaking about, layering and asymmetry of power dynamics, human security issues, if the United States takes a very Cold War-like great power, strictly realist view, I think it'll do two things. It'll miss a lot of opportunities. It'll start forcing people into camps. And the third thing is it can have, and whether the United States or China or any other great powers take this view, it blinds you to opportunities. And like we saw in the Cold War, the going in like a bull in the china shop and just thinking macro and ignoring the local factors creates the seeds to problems that come up and bite you later. And so a lot of the problems we see today, you can trace directly back to this mentality. And one thing I try to caution my students with is the theoretical view you take from an international relations perspective is a choice. We don't have to take a Cold War type realist macro level mentality. We can take a more sophisticated approach. So even though these dynamics are inherent in the system, I think that we do have to realize that there is a choice in the lenses we use to look through it. And I just don't think a narrow containment thing will work.
Well,
and even if it works in the short term, I think it'll preclude opportunities and plant the seeds for other problems later on.
True, it's very difficult to indulge in the zero-sum game to the last T. It's very difficult. And it's not good for anyone. That is true. Let's hope and see that it moves properly. But one more question, maybe perhaps on the China only. Is China well ahead in the game as it asserts itself on the continent economically, militarily, and politically?
Who is this for?
No, this is, I've got some questions. So it's one of those. There is one from Nepal, which is there in the chat box. And that I'll leave to whoever wishes to answer that, because it's a very pertinent question on the competition because of the Nepal's water resources. But the question is,
May I interrupt, Ambassador? I guess he put the questions for the South Asia panel that happened yesterday, maybe, and he refined the question in the another chat. Mangesh, could you please look at the question again? He wrote something, and if
Can you hear me?
yes,
Yes.
Hello. Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah. I will just reframe the question. It's about Nepal. I'll just reframe it. We have he is concerned about water resources. So
right.
what I'll just twist the question. We'll come back from Nepal right to Horn of Africa. You got the Nile River flowing from Ethiopia, the Horn of Africa, going all the way to Egypt. There's already a problem between I think Ethiopia, one of the countries, is constructing a dam on the Nile River, and Egyptians are getting jittery about it. So in the future, do you see this Horn of Africa dilemma, problems, and a greater power competition shifting toward water resources as we have a climate change which is taking over and water is getting much more, water resources are getting much more scarce?
Well, Mangesh, you know that what is happening on this GERD dam, Ethiopia has constructed, Sudan is benefiting through the electricity, and Egypt is continuing to oppose the filling because it feels that it will not have enough water. Ethiopia has sufficient water, so it doesn't need out of the dam, but it needs electricity from that point of view. So they are marketing it to Sudan. That's quite happening. There is discussion going on how to reduce this confrontation. So while there is a major problem, and this is a historic problem, it's not something that can go away. And as we all know that there have been a lot of debate about it, that future wars will be for the water. Most of the countries, the water tables are really going down. And so the countries that have a little bit of excess of water availability, or rather on the surface of it, they obviously might become a target of the future competition. And that's what I would like to tell our friend from Nepal, as well as it's likewise in Africa, the Horn of Africa or elsewhere. Even in certain countries, like we are seeing what is happening in Brazil, in Amazon, that was a major issue. So nature has given enough bounty, but how we have misused it. So we are going through this climate, and that's what the war is all about. Its shape and form of this conflict has changed significantly, depending on which country is there. The developed countries today want the developing countries to pay for their sins. I mean, that has been the major problem in today's time and age. So as was mentioned by Dr. Conte, that the weaker countries tend to be the victims. And that's something is very difficult because we're not living in a fair world. That's what I would like to put on this issue. Any other comments on this are most welcome.
I have a question to Dr. Edmondson, and maybe
You have?
Yeah. So
Yeah,
and Dr. Jesper too. Like, if United States should stay away countering China, that how do you see the China and Saudi Arabia's cozy up, and the alliance, kind of alliance that China wants to bring Saudi Arabia in different platforms like BRIC, like related to the Indo-Pacific and Asian too. So, and how do you see the Iran threat? Like when we see that Saudi Arabia and China's alliance or causing up, if not alliance, and then Iran is also there. So in that case, the United States should stay away countering this kind of alliance. I would like to take the first, Mr. Edmondson, and then Dr. Jespero.
Yeah, I think it's a bit of and I was saying amen in my head to what Chris was saying about trying to advise his students to not look at it through a very kind of limited realist viewpoint, zero-sum sort of way of thinking about it, because if we do that, I do think if we do focus on China, we'll wind up working against the very thing that we're trying to prevent, which is a consolidation of Chinese interest in cozying up to various authoritarian regimes, or to alienate, what Mr. Conte referred to as alienated Africans already, to say that, okay, these people, they don't really, they're not even making an effort to see things from our perspective. They're not engaging us in our own terms. They're fixated on China. And if we do that, then that's just increases the likelihood that China will increase its influence and appeal. When I think that it could be leveling off in the past, in the past few years. I do think that the sheer amount, the sheer level of Chinese investment in Africa, the BRI investments have leveled off to some degree. I think that they've outstripped the screws in some cases. I think that the African publics have started to recognize, the fact that they could be enabling the very corrupt, the very corruption that they criticize about their own governments. They don't see them as a partner, perhaps, for their future aspirations. I do think that the U.S., rather than focusing on what China's doing or any of these external actors are doing, is trying to focus more on understanding the various African populations and their aspirations, and that honestly, I think dovetails with it is a tension in our own kind of foreign policy and strategic outlook. I mean, we've engaged in this kind of like sort of an our man in Africa mentality for a long time, through the Cold War and other ways. But I do think that there's another part of an American strategic vision, which is about more representative forms of government, even though I don't think most Africans would necessarily look for specifically American model of democracy or electoral democracy. I do think that there's masses of folks that do want to have more, that are sick of, living under kleptocratic regimes and corrupt regimes that are enabled by some of the relations with these external powers, and to not just become part of that, competing with China for who can cozy up to whichever dictator or more authoritarian ruler best versus the other. And so I think long term, something that having kind of the realities of our engagement meet our rhetoric in closer ways in terms of trying to develop stronger civil societies and more representative forms of governance that work and that are tailored to more local context. Again, not sort of bringing in an external model and hoping that they conform.
Yes, thanks. I'd just like to echo mostly what Scott said, and I think that the directionality we look at this is important. If we frame our dealings with the region firstly through China, we go down the road that we talked about earlier, and I think it's better to look at the countries and populations in the region and work on areas where we have mutual interests first and build our relationships from the bottom up. And on some levels that will counterbalance what China's doing in certain important areas. Doesn't mean there's nothing that we ever contest or counter China on, but containing it or looking through it strictly that lens loses opportunity. And I also think we do a disservice to the Africans when we assume that China has all the cards and we approach the region through China because we deny African agency. I mean, like Scott said, there are populations that are sick of what the Chinese are doing in some cases. In some areas, the Chinese are making missteps. So we almost disempower Africans and empower the Chinese by looking at them as this kind of monolith that gets to do what they want. And we should really focus on building our own relationships with the countries and people of the region and start from there rather than the other way around.
Well, thank you very much for very considered and profound comments. And I hope the governments follow that kind of policy. But let's see what happens, how China plays out. We have recently seen the US defense strategy that came out. In China is the major strategic competitor and the threat to the US. And we have seen what is happening in China. Xi Jinping, perhaps in his third avatar, he will try to achieve what he has been trying to do that and leave a legacy of the Mao Zedong. But at the same time, this has been a very enlightening discussion due to the profound comments made by all the speakers. We focused on all the key dimensions. Whereas the superpower politics will continue to play, we'll have to see what happens to Russia-Ukraine war and what emerges thereafter. But in the meantime, the maintaining the Red Sea security and the Horn of Africa, we need to monitor developments in the Yemen crisis, maintaining the stability of the Somali government from collapse, stability of the Sudanese regime, lowering the threshold as far as tensions between Egypt and Ethiopia are concerned. Sudan, another one. These countries have also going through their own pains and the problems as a result of the Arab Spring 2.0 or 1.0, whatever, whichever we look at it. And if we can help their stability and economic development, so much the better. But unfortunately, I think we will have to see that even among the regional powers, middle powers, as Omar put it, they are also having their own contestations. Even UAE and Saudi Arabia are not on the same page for everything. And so we'll have to see how they will log their horns in the Horn of Africa. I must thank you very much for your very kind comments and very enlightening views on this matter. And we hope that these will be taken on board while we are working on some kind of direction for the emerging transitional global order. Thank you once again. And Dr. Indu, back to you, please.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you so much. Mr. Samant, would you like to say?
Hello, can you hear me, Saul?
Yes.
Yeah. I thank you on behalf of the Consortium of Indo-Pacific Researchers for sharing the knowledge and about the region, which is up till now relegated to background considering Middle East and China and what is happening in Ukraine. But I think it's a area which has been long neglected, and the world and especially the world powers cannot keep on neglecting that area. Only my position is that it should not be the Middle East of the future, like what is happening in Iran. Saudi Arabia should not take the place of Iran, as Iran is doing in the Middle East. So let's hope for a peaceful resolution of all the conflicts in the area. I once again thank you all of you for attending this conference. Thank you once again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you, Dr. Jasbro. Thank you, Dr. Edmondson, Mr. Omar, Michael. Thank you so much. And we will share the video recording soon.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Stay safe.
Thank
Thank
you
you.
very much.
Excellent. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ambassador, you did a great job moderating the session.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Indo.
Thank you, Michael.
Right.
Good presentation.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Scott. Bye.